Thank you, Vijayji. Thank you, Professor Sureshji, whom I met for the first time since he has taken over the directorship of India Habitat Center. Our association with India Habitat Center goes back, of course, many years. And one of the events that I remember very clearly is in 2003 when we organized a week-long Festival of Compassion using all the amenities that you have at India Habitat Center. So, and you also host the Office of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility, which was founded on support from what His Holiness received from the Nobel Peace Prize. Rajiv continues to be here, and our association goes back many years. You want to take this forward with Bharat, both Kendra. Thank you very much, Sureshji. And just before coming here, we had a little chat in his office. Sureshji comes from Kerala. I was born in Karnataka. Of course, I can say Namaskara and Vanakkam and all that, but in Kerala it's Namaskaram. So it's Keralam, Namaskaram. I always say I feel like an Indian, because even though I'm a Tibetan by birth, born in India, been in exile all my life, including my brothers and sisters who are on this side of the aisle. So the topic today is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's Guru-Dakshina to Bharat, India. Now, Guru-Dakshina is, I understand, is a form of gratitude to your teacher for all the knowledge that was transferred to you in any form, whether it's a feast or any form of gratitude. So I was not sure how do I put this, because we have a lot of things to thank India for, historically. That's why when you talk about contribution of the Tibetans in India, first, I think we need to talk about the connections between India and Tibet, historically. Because there are several versions of the first king of Tibet. One says it came from southern Tibet. Two versions say that the first king of Tibet, 2,200 years ago, also say it came from India. So that connection has always been there. And around 2nd, 3rd century, I think King Hatthotri Nyingma of Tibet received a first sacred text. Maybe that was around the time when, during the Kushanas, Buddhism spread in Central Asia in 2nd and 3rd century. And in 3rd century, Buddhism also spread to China, but it never came to Tibet, because Tibet is the highest plateau and the largest plateau on earth. It's not possible for people to just come into Tibet. You have to climb so many mountains and down valleys and mountains and valleys number of times before you reach the capital, Lhasa. So Tibetans practice what is called as Pon religion, the pre-Buddhist religion called Pon, and there must have been a language for sure. But in 7th century, King Songtsen Gampo, the first religious king of Tibet, who also expanded Tibet's territory during those times, sent his minister, Thumisambota, to invent a Tibetan script to India. So the today's Tibetan script is based on Indian Gupta script. So even now, our consonants, 30 consonants and 4 vowels, are very similar to Hindi, you know. So you have Devanagari and Assamese and Punjabis, all these languages originating from the Gupta Brahmi script, and Tibetan script is also one among them. Kaka Kanga, Cha Cha Chanya, Ta Ta Tana, Pa Pa Pama, Za Za Zawa, Shasa Aya, Ra La Shasa. You know, so all these are very similar like Hindi. And Hindi also has a lot of vowels, A, E, E, U, U, A, O, Aha, which we learned in school up to grade 8. But we have only 4 vowels, the E, U, A, O. So, but it's one of the now 15 oldest languages in the world, the Tibetan language. And just recently, one of our monks worked on a Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary, which came to be about 223 volumes of Tibetan to Tibetan dictionary, which One, we presented to the Czech National Library. I'm very happy that Ambassador Zikova, Her Excellency, is here. She was also present when we presented the copy, and we presented one copy to Library of Congress. It was Kishi Mulam who worked on this for 6 long years. So that speaks for the importance of Tibetan language. So, and then the 2 Buddha statues first came to Tibet during 7th century. One from China, because the Tibetan emperor had a Chinese consort, Wenchen Kongchu, and another Buddha statue came from Nepal, because that same Tibetan emperor had a Nepalese consort called Devi. So then in 8th century, during King Trisong Dezen's time, then Shantarakshita came to Tibet, Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche came to Tibet, and Shantarakshita's disciple Kamalashila, and many of them. During those times, there were also Chinese monks in Tibet. And the Tibetan king organized a big debate between Kamalashila and the Chinese Hoshangs. And then the Tibetan king decided that they will adopt the Nalanda monastic education in Tibet, not the Chinese version of Buddhism. So since then, we have been following the Nalanda tradition. Between 7th to 9th century, Tibet became a big empire. We even dethroned the emperor of China at one time and put a puppet king there, went even up to Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan. That used to be extent of Tibetan empire at one time between 7th to 9th century. Then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years. 100 years there was degeneration of Buddhism in Tibet with a lot of adulteration on Buddha's teachings. Then Atisha came to Tibet. Atisha Dipankara came to Tibet in the late 10th century, and then he revised all the Buddha's teachings, and that became the second propagation of Buddhism in Tibet. And then during those periods in 11th century, many Tibetans came to India several times, including Marpa. Several times. You can imagine Tibetans coming from Tibet, climbing down so many mountains, valleys, coming into India 2-3 times in his lifetime to study under Indian Buddhist masters, Naropa and Tilopa. And then the Kagyu tradition started, the Kagyu school of Buddhist thought. And then the Sakya tradition of Buddhist thought also started, and eventually it also led to the founding of the Gelugpa tradition in the early 15th century or late 14th century with Je Tsongkhapa. Even Je Tsongkhapa's teachings also has a lot of references to Buddhist masters like Nagarjuna and Aryadeva and Asanga and Dignath and so many. Now we count 17 Indian Pandits as the root of teachings in Buddha, in Tibet. So even now, if you visit Tibetan monasteries here in India, you will see the paintings of all these 17 Panditas, whose composition we study, mostly the middle way policy or emptiness or, all the philosophical details. Even now, His Holiness says, when you talk about ancient Indian wisdom and psychology, His Holiness sometimes says that Western psychology compared to Indian psychology, ancient Indian psychology is like kindergarten. So Indian psychology is very, very deep, very, very, deeply studied by so many masters. And that now Tibetans decided, because when Shantarakshita told the Tibetans, since you have your own language, instead of me teaching you in Pali or Sanskrit, why don't you transliterate all the teachings into Tibetan? And that's exactly what the Tibetans did for 5 centuries, from 8th century to 13th century, before Buddhism almost vanished out of India, when Otantapuri and Nalanda and Vikramashila were destroyed by the Khiljis in 13th century, end of the 12th century and 13th century. By the way, the Khiljis also tried to come into Tibet, because Tibet was known for horses, and Khilji wanted to control that trade route, and he sent 10,000 army in 1205 or 1206 into Tibet from the Chumbi Valley, and only 100 cavalry returned back. So that speaks for the protection of Tibet on the border, even during the time of disintegration. So Tibetans, we have preserved one part of ancient Indian wisdom, and we are very proud to be repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom. Today, if you want to study Buddhism in its entirety, then Tibetan is the only language that you can study all of it. And we are in the process of digitizing all the Buddha's teachings, 110 texts, 200 plus commentaries by renowned pundits and masters on Buddhism, and then all the compositions by Tibetan masters. Over the centuries, we have been studying Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, and developing the identity of our existence in this world. So all these have happened because of India. Historically, we don't have much relation with the Chinese. Between 7th to 9th century, when Tibet was a big empire, even the Chinese were also on one side. They had nothing to do with the Tibetans. Then the Mongols became a big power by the end of 12th century, beginning of 13th century, with Genghis Khan and his sons. And when they became a big power, we developed relations with the Mongols. Even before Kublai Khan invaded China in 1271. So Drogyen Chögye Pakpa, the Sakya Lama, was a disciple of Sakya Pandita, became the preceptor to the Mongol Khan. And this was middle of 13th century, or just after the middle of 13th century, in 1250s, 60s. Then Kublai Khan invaded China in 1271, which became the Yuan dynasty in China. So Kublai Khan invaded the whole of China by 1278. So the Yuan dynasty in China, it's a Chinese name, but it's a Mongol empire. It's not a Chinese empire. And we had relations with the Mongols even before the Chinese, under those circumstances in that era. And the Mongols ruled China from 1271 to 1368. And the Tibetans were ruled later by the Sakyapas, because they were investitured by the Mongol Khans to rule Tibet, the 3 provinces of Tibet. And when the Yuan dynasty fell and the Ming came in, they ruled China from 1368 to 1644. But we had no relations with the Mings, except for some religious exchange. Our relations were always with the Mongols, till up to 1720. So even then, if you take the historical comparison, the 5th Dalai Lama took over the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1642, 2 years before the Qings overthrew the Mings in China. So if you do all these comparative historical studies, then you will realize that Tibet has always been an independent country politically. Of course, with India, there were not many wars. There was never ever war with India. During 8th century, it is said that Tibetan army came up to Bodh Gaya, but they were not stopped by Indians on the way. And they came to Bodh Gaya, collected the relics of Buddha, and went back. That's all we hear about Tibet-India relations on that sense. So there was never ever a war. We always lived in peace. We lived in the mountains, and then everybody were around this high plateau. So we have a lot to thank India for, because of her script, the religion that defines our way of life also came from India. So we don't feel any different when we are in India. We all think alike. Our philosophy is same. And of course, most recently, when Communist China invaded Tibet in 1950, that was just 1 year after the formation of the Republic of China. They started invading eastern Tibet, and then they came to Chamdo by October 1950. And we lost because we never maintained a very strong army. We always believed in peace. And even by the time we lost our country, there were hardly any border patrols on the Tibetan-India border. If you ask Indian elderlies, they would tell you there were hardly any border patrol on the border between India. Today, if you look at what is happening there, then it's quite scary that both the governments are spending so much money on defense. Instead, if that could be spent on education and poverty alleviation, on employment, I think both countries would benefit much more than what they're spending on the border today. When His Holiness came here, as Vijay Krantiji said, we were put up in 2 camps in Buxar and Misamari in Assam and that area, northeast India. And then slowly, Pandit Nehru wrote to all the chief ministers asking who would be willing to provide land for the rehabilitation of the Tibetan asylees. And Karnataka was the first to offer 3,000 acres of land because His Holiness had visited India in 1956-57 during the 2,500 Buddha Jayanti. And during those times, His Holiness visited Nagarjuna Konda in today's Telangana, but Andhra Pradesh earlier, which used to be the birthplace of Nagarjuna. So His Holiness went on a pilgrimage there and met with Nijalingappa, and Nijalingappa was the first to offer. So we have 5 settlements in Karnataka today, which is the largest concentration of Tibetans outside Tibet. Many believe that most of the Tibetans are in Dharamsala, which is not so. It's only because of the schools that we have in Dharamsala that the population is beyond 10,000. Otherwise, much of the larger Tibetan populations are in. So all we can say in the form of Guru-Dakshina, of course, the introduction of democracy, the very reason that we exist here in India and in Himachal Pradesh, speaking about all the, elements of democratic polity within this administration, it was all made possible because of the long-term vision of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the help of Indian government, without whom we don't exist. I keep saying we don't exist if it is not for the government of India. So we have so many things to thank India for. So all we can say is in the form of Guru-Dakshina, because His Holiness represents Tibetans and Tibet. He is the other side of the same coin. And we can say that we brought back Buddhism into India since we came into exile. Historically, it was bad news for us when we lost our country to communist China. But then, if you look at the positive side of it, if Tibet had not lost its independence, then His Holiness would have been living in Potala or the Nubulinga, maybe travel in some parts of Tibet, but not get the exposure that he got after coming into exile. So if we look at the positive side, then we can say that His Holiness' departure from Tibet and coming into exile has made it possible for him to spread the message of ahimsa and karuna, compassion and non-violence, not only vocal non-violence or physical non-violence, non-violence from the mind. Every morning His Holiness keeps saying, the moment I wake up, I think about compassion, helping others. So that is how you give direction to your daily life. Because compassion is not something that you can learn during a workshop or something. It has to be practiced every single minute, every second, every minute, every hour, every day, every year, till the end of your life. So, and His Holiness has today become the messenger of ancient Indian wisdom. He keeps saying, I'm son of India. And he lived all his life here in India. And we are very thankful to the government and the people of India, both at the central and state governments, who have provided shelter to the Tibetans. And we continue to struggle today. Till Tibetans inside Tibet are not free, we will continue to struggle. So this is our pledge, and we follow His Holiness. We follow non-violence as a means. We look forward to a negotiated solution that is mutually beneficial. Under those circumstances, then it could have a lasting effect. If you look at conflicts that are happening around the world today, you don't know whether you are really resolving one problem or creating more problems for future. So non-violence, negotiation are the only ways to resolve conflicts. His Holiness has always appreciated common interests of humanity, appreciates the concept of European Union. Even now, His Holiness keeps repeating that if it had not been for the concept of European Union, Europeans would still be fighting and killing each other. So if it can be applied to Europe, then why not Tibet with China? But of course, then a lot of things needs to be addressed. If Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved peacefully, then it can contribute to a lot of trust and stability in the region, not only in Tibet, because Tibet borders with so many different countries. And I want to end by saying, when we think about His Holiness, when we think about the wisdom of his ancient India, now His Holiness is starting an institute in Bodh Gaya, where you can study ancient Indian wisdom. And His Holiness has 4 principal commitments drawn from all the learnings that he had over the years. 1, His Holiness keeps saying, I am just one human being out of 8 billion human beings in this world. So as one human being, my responsibility is to promote moral values. Doesn't matter whether you are a believer or a non-believer. That's why His Holiness worked for many years with Emory University to develop a course called C Learning, the social, emotional, and ethical learning, because I told that there are many schools who teach social and emotional learning, but what is missing is ethical. I remember one British politician meeting His Holiness, and his first question to His Holiness was, we have a lot of problem with youth. And His Holiness said, everything is wrong with modern education, because too much focus on materialism, not developing the heart. So C Learning, I consider, is one of the greatest contribution of His Holiness to humanity. So in the case of Tibet, whether we like it or not, we don't have a Hanuman to lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Arabian or Bay of Bengal near India. So whenever we get to go back, we have to live in peace with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Bhutanese, with the Nepalese. And as neighbors, if you cannot live in peace, then why live as neighbors in the first place? Right? So this is His Holiness thought. And the second commitment of His Holiness says, I'm a simple Buddhist monk. Right? And as a Buddhist monk, he practices Buddhism. But then you have so many, 8 billion people in this world with all different physical appearances and that many mental dispositions and inclinations. Everybody has. So depending on their mental dispositions and inclinations, whatever religion they want to follow, everybody is free to follow that. So you practice your own religion, but you respect all other religions. And that is what His Holiness has been doing all his life. And religion is supposed to bring peace to humanity, but instead it is becoming a tool for conflicts and disruptions in this world. So His Holiness always promotes interreligious harmony. His Holiness participated and also led many of the interreligious harmony conferences around the world. And then his third commitment is to Tibet. It's not because Tibet is very special because of the Dalai Lama or his people. The Tibet is special because of its geostrategic importance. It's located in the center of Asia. It borders with so many countries, up to Burma, and the whole of North India, from Arunachal Pradesh to Jammu Kashmir. It's a big land. Just recently, one of our friends told me, I went to the Tibet Museum and I found that Tibet is so huge. So if you don't understand the size of Tibet, then how can you understand the security of India? And historically, we have been the political buffer. Now we want to become the political bridge between India and China, develop more trust so that we can bring more peace and prosperity to everybody. So Tibet is not only important for Tibet because of that. Tibet is important for the whole world because of its environment, because of its location. We call our land the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. We have Himalayas from Afghanistan to Burma in the south of Tibet, which is north of India. We have the Karakoram in the west and the Kunlun in the north and the great deserts, the Changtang in the northwest, and then so many mountain ranges in the east. So Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. And then Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world because of its altitude. The average altitude of Tibet is about 16,010 feet according to NASA. And that's why I keep talking about this. When I went to Japan, I asked them, which is your highest mountain? The Mount Fuji, how high? 3,700, 3,800 meters. And I told them that is like base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there, your highest mountain, right? So just to give them an impression of how high Tibet is and how valuable it is. Now, Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers, including the Yalu River and Yangtze, that flows into northern and southern China, without which they will not be able to support its 1.4 billion people. These are the two lifelines of China that originates from Tibet. And Chinese civilization also originated on the Yalu River. Then you have the Mekong flowing into 5 Southeast Asian countries: Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia, Burma. Right now, so many people's lives are getting affected because China is building multiple dams on the rivers before it flows into another country. It's a transnational river. And China does not share any hydrological data, that they use Tibet's water like a tap. If there is excess, they let it flow. You have flood downstreams. If there is shortage, they shut it off, and you have drought downstreams. People in these countries are now, their livelihoods are changing. And then rivers that flows into Burma, like Salween, Irrawaddy, then Brahmaputra, starting from western Tibet to eastern Tibet. Now China is building the biggest hydropower project there, which will produce 2.8 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest on Yangtze. Now they are building it biggest on Brahmaputra. Indian politicians have already started calling it a water bomb because Tibetan plateau came up about 50 million years ago. Just recently, few days back, when I was in Dharamsala, there was earthquake. In Nepal also, in Afghanistan. This whole default line that flows because of the seismic shift that is happening could be very, very consequential for people living downstream if something happens to that side of a dam inside Tibet. Then the Indus and the Jhelum flow from Tibet into India and then into Pakistan. It's also home to Harappan, one of the oldest civilizations. Indus Valley civilization. So all these countries that we are talking about are some of the most densely populated areas in this world. So we are talking about serious food security and water security in future, apart from political consequences that the world has to bear. But unfortunately, the downstream countries are not able to speak up to China. India is just waking up to the reality of what China is doing inside Tibet. So we need to come together. We will keep fighting. We have our strategy. We maintain a very transparent relationship with the government of India. And we have, as I always say, Tibetans have a saying, when children have problems, they have nowhere else to go but to their parents. And when we face problem, we go to government of India as a parent to seek support. And they have always been there for us, and for which I think His Holiness, you don't have to, even at this age, if an Indian comes to meet with His Holiness, you don't have to remind His Holiness to thank India. It comes naturally from His Holiness. And of course, Chinese government keeps saying His Holiness can return back, but there is a condition that he should stay back for good. And His Holiness says, if I get an opportunity, I'll go, but I'll not live there because there is no freedom there. And I don't want to die with Chinese on my bedside. I want to die with Indians on my bedside. So we have managed to re-establish many of the monasteries that were destroyed by China. 1.42 million Tibetans died as a direct or indirect result of China's occupation. Some 6,000 monasteries were destroyed. Now there's a facade of being rebuilt, but the real education is not there inside Tibet. If you look at, many people can't even imagine what is going on. Just because there is no protests or no killings, that doesn't mean that Tibetans are free. Now there is huge surveillance and control. It's more like George Orwell's 1984 having come into reality, where the state controls everything. And they are also being aided by Silicon Valley companies, supplying tools for, and now China is exporting that to all the autocratic countries to bring in more allies on their side when all these geopolitical shifts are happening. So it's high time that we realize what is happening in the neighborhood, particularly for Indians, because Tibet is directly connected to India's security, and there is no two ways about it. Everybody in the know knows about it. So we will be moving forward with our movement. So in my second term, there are a lot of things that we need to do, including, of course, one of our main responsibilities to see how we can resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, which does not seem to be possible right now. There doesn't seem to be much space if you look at the policies and programs of the Chinese government. And on 26th of this month, we will be having another event here in Delhi to protest the latest Chinese law called the Ethnic Unity and Progress Law. Communists always have very nice names for programs that has very adverse impact on people. So the whole idea is to how to make sure that Tibetan identity is destroyed. And that is part of India's culture that we have preserved. So thank you very much for this occasion. And thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Sureshji, for organizing this, and Vijayji for chairing the session.